The ballroom smelled like candle wax and roasted chicken, and my father's voice was already too loud before he even reached the microphone. I remember thinking, standing near the back wall in a plain gray dress, that I had worn the wrong color for a room full of people who had spent their whole lives deciding I did not belong in rooms like this one. 300 people sat at round tables draped in white linen under a banner that read, Whitfield Industries, 75 years, and my father, Richard Bennett, stood at the podium in a rented tuxedo, holding a small crystal plaque that said, Employee of Excellence, 32 years of service. He was beaming. He always beamed when a room was looking at him. 32 years, he said into the microphone, and his voice cracked with a pride I had not heard directed at me since I was 7 years old. 32 years of showing up, of doing the work, of being the kind of person this company can count on. He paused, scanning the crowd the way he used to scan a dinner table, looking for someone smaller than him to make his point land harder. Not everybody in my family understands that, he said, and I felt my stomach drop the way it used to drop when I was a teenager and I heard that particular shift in his tone. Some people never learn how to hold a job, never learn how to show up. We used to joke that our younger daughter would need us to bail her out until she was 50. A ripple of laughter moved through the tables, uncertain, polite, the kind of laughter people give a boss's joke whether or not it is funny. I did not laugh. I stood very still, the way I had trained myself to stand still through 20 years of moments like this one, and I watched my mother, Susan, nod along at the head table in a burgundy dress she had bought specifically for tonight, her hand resting on my sister's arm as if bracing herself against a memory she had decided long ago was mine to carry alone. My sister, Kimberly, sat beside her husband, Trevor, both of them glowing under the chandelier light, Kim in a champagne gown that probably cost more than what our mother made in a month at the payroll desk, Trevor in a suit so precisely tailored it looked like armor. Trevor was the company's chief operating officer. Kim ran marketing. My parents had worked the floor and the back office for decades, and I was, in my father's telling, the one who never learned how to hold a job. Here is the part they did not know, standing in that ballroom under that banner. I was not a guest that night. I was not a +1, and I was not there because Kim had grudgingly added my name to a table she did not want me at. I was there because I owned 41% of Whitfield Industries outright, and through the holding company I controlled, I held the deciding vote on every major decision the board would ever make. They knew me as C.J. Winslow, managing partner of Ashcroft Capital. They did not know that C.J. Winslow was Claire Josephine Bennett, the daughter they had spent 2 decades calling a disappointment. In 11 days, that would no longer be a secret. But that night, under my father's laughter and my mother's silence, I smiled the small, practiced smile I had perfected over the years, thanked the room in my head for reminding me exactly why I had built what I built, and let every person in that ballroom go on believing I was nobody. If you have ever had to stand quietly in a room while your own family decided who you were allowed to be, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, because I think you already understand what it costs to survive people like this with your composure intact. I want to take you back further than that ballroom, because you cannot understand what happened over the 11 days that followed without understanding who I was before any of it, and who my family had already decided I would always be. I was born the second daughter in a house where the first daughter was already treated like a small miracle, and I do not say that with bitterness anymore, only with clarity, because clarity is the thing I built my entire life around once I stopped needing anyone's approval to survive. Kim was 3 years older than me, effortless in the particular way that made adults relax around her. Good at school without trying, good at sports without training, good at being liked without ever once having to be kind. My parents built their whole identity as a family around Kim's easy successes, and by the time I was old enough to notice the pattern, it had already hardened into something permanent, something with its own gravity, pulling every ounce of praise in the house toward her side of the room. I was not a bad child. I want to say that plainly, because for years I believed I must have been, simply because of how consistently I was treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. I was quiet. I asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. I preferred drawing floor plans of houses that did not exist to playing the sports Kim excelled at. And my father used to look at my sketchbooks the way you might look at a stain on a carpet, something to be addressed rather than admired. My mother's cruelty was quieter than my father's, and in some ways it cut deeper because it wore the costume of concern. "We just worry about you," she would say, in the voice she used for talking about relatives with drinking problems. "You have always been the sensitive one." Sensitive was the word she used instead of saying what she meant, which was that I felt things too visibly for a family that had decided feelings were an inconvenience. The break came when I was 22, in the spring, 3 months after my engagement to a man named Peter ended in the ugliest way an engagement can end, with him leaving for another woman 2 weeks before the invitations were supposed to go out. I fell apart, not in the dramatic way people fall apart in movies, but in the quiet, grinding way real people fall apart, unable to get out of bed some mornings, unable to hold down the receptionist job I had taken while I finished my degree, watching the future I had planned collapse into something unrecognizable. My family's response was not comfort, it was accounting. My father sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where he would later hand out plaques and praise to people who showed up on time, and he told me that some people were simply not built for stability, that he had always suspected as much about me, and that Kim had never once given them a single reason to worry. That was the night the label hardened into something permanent, the family failure, the one who could not keep it together, the one who would always need bailing out. There was exactly one person in that house who did not treat my collapse as a verdict, and that was my grandmother, Eleanor. My mother's mother. We called her Nana Ellie, and she was the only adult in my childhood who ever looked at my sketchbooks and asked real questions instead of polite ones. She had a way of tilting her head when she listened to you that made you feel, for the length of that conversation, like the most important person in the world. Nana Ellie had grown up with a story she rarely told in full, about her own father, a man named Augustus Whitfield, who had built a small furniture workshop in our town of Mill Haven, Ohio, back in the years after the war, and who had lost control of it decades later to a syndicate of investors after a series of bad debts and a business partner who was more predator than partner. She told me once, when I was maybe 9 years old, sitting on her porch with lemonade sweating in our hands, that losing that company had broken something in her own father that never fully healed, and that the shame of it had passed down through the family like a piece of furniture nobody wanted, but nobody could throw away either. I did not think much of that story as a child. It was simply one of Nana Ellie's porch stories, filed away with all the others. I did not know yet how much that story would come to matter, or how directly it would eventually intersect with a certain furniture manufacturer 3 towns over that employed half my family and had, at some point in its long history, quietly changed its name to Whitfield Industries, in honor of the very founder my great-grandfather had been forced out by. 2 weeks after that awful conversation at the kitchen table, Nana Ellie showed up at the studio apartment I was renting, uninvited, carrying a manila envelope. Inside it was a check for $40,000, money from a life insurance policy her late husband had left her. Money she said she did not need and had been saving for exactly the right moment to give away. "You are not a failure," she told me, holding both my hands in hers, her grip stronger than I expected from a woman her age. "You are the only one in this family who has ever actually looked at me when I talk. Go build something. I do not care what. Just go build it, far away from people who cannot see you." I left Millhaven 3 months later with that check, a duffel bag, and absolutely no plan beyond getting somewhere my last name did not come preloaded with a verdict. I ended up in Chicago, waiting tables at a diner near the university, taking night classes in finance because I had discovered, almost by accident, that I had a gift for reading numbers the way other people read faces, understanding what a spreadsheet was actually trying to tell you underneath what it appeared to say. My family's contact with me over the next several years thinned to almost nothing. A birthday card from my mother some years, forgotten in others. A single, brutal phone call from my father the Christmas I was 26, in which he asked, without preamble, whether I had finally found steady work, and when I told him I was doing consulting for a small investment fund, he laughed, actually laughed, and said he would believe it when he saw a paycheck with my name on it that did not bounce. He never saw that paycheck. Because by the time my consulting work had turned into something real, I had already made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I would never again hand my family a single piece of information they could use to measure me, mock me, or manage me. If they wanted to know who Claire Bennett had become, they would have to earn that knowledge. And they never once tried. By the time I turned 30, I was managing a small portfolio for a boutique investment firm in Chicago, and the $40,000 from Nana Ellie had become, through a combination of discipline, a handful of well-timed real estate purchases in a recovering neighborhood, and an almost obsessive appetite for understanding distressed manufacturing companies that everyone else had written off, something closer to $4 million. I did not tell my family a single figure. I did not tell them anything at all. At 33, I left the firm and started my own holding company, which I named Ashcroft Capital, after the street in Chicago where I had rented my very first apartment above a laundromat, the first place that had ever felt entirely, completely mine. I built it slowly and quietly, acquiring small, undervalued manufacturing operations that larger funds considered too regional, too unglamorous, too dependent on aging equipment and stubborn, small-town labor forces to be worth the trouble. I changed how the world knew me during those years, not through any legal name change, but through the simple mechanics of discretion. My legal name remained Claire Josephine Bennett, but every filing, every deal memo, every handshake in a boardroom happened under the name C.J. Winslow, Winslow being my grandmother's maiden name before she married my grandfather Kerr, a small private tribute that nobody in my family would have recognized even if they had been looking, which they never were. Nana Ellie died when I was 36, in her sleep, in the same house where she had once handed me that manila envelope, and I flew back to Millhaven for the funeral under my real name, sitting in the back pew of a church my family barely acknowledged me inside of. My mother hugged me once, stiffly, at the reception afterward, and told me Nana Ellie would have wanted the family together, as if the family had ever once made room for me to be part of it. I left before the reception ended. It was going through her things afterward, in a small storage unit she had kept for decades that nobody else in the family had bothered to claim, that I found the second envelope, this one containing yellowed photographs of a modest brick workshop with a hand-painted sign that read Whitfield Furniture Company, and a folder of old newspaper clippings about Augustus Whitfield's ouster from the very business he had built with his own hands. Taped to the inside of the folder was a note in Nana Ellie's careful handwriting. It said simply, "Some things are worth taking back." I did not fully understand at the time what she meant by that. I would understand within the year. 3 months after the funeral, one of my analysts flagged a distressed acquisition opportunity crossing our desk, a mid-sized furniture and cabinetry manufacturer in northern Ohio, family-founded, currently owned by an aging private equity consortium looking to exit after years of flat growth. The company was called Whitfield Industries. I read the name twice before I understood what I was looking at. It was headquartered in Millhaven. It employed roughly 600 people. And according to the employee roster my analyst pulled as part of routine due diligence, it currently employed, in its logistics division, a floor supervisor named Richard Bennett, and in its payroll department, a woman named Susan Bennett. I sat with that information for 11 days before I made a decision, which felt, looking back, like a strange echo of the 11 days that would later separate my father's toast from everything that came after. I could have walked away from the deal entirely, let some other fund take it, avoided my family and their company, and the entire tangled inheritance of shame and pride Nana Ellie had left curled inside that folder. Instead, I did the opposite. I flew to Millhaven under a name none of them would recognize, toured the plant floor disguised as a due diligence consultant in a hard hat and a visitor badge, and watched my father direct a forklift crew from 30 feet away without once looking in my direction. I closed the acquisition 4 months later. Ashcroft Capital took a 41% controlling stake in Whitfield Industries, structured through a private holding vehicle that kept my name off every public document that mattered. And I installed a seasoned operator named Daniel Reyes as president and chief executive, the only person outside my closest legal counsel who knew that C.J. Winslow, the controlling shareholder he answered to, was the estranged daughter of 2 of his own longtime employees. Daniel asked me, the day I told him, whether I intended to ever tell my family the truth. I told him I did not know yet. I told him that for the first time in my adult life, I had actual leverage over the people who had spent 2 decades deciding what I was worth. And I was not going to waste that leverage on an impulse. I was going to wait until it mattered. I did not know at the time just how much it would come to matter, or how directly it would end up saving the very jobs my parents depended on to survive. For 5 years, I ran that company from a careful distance, visiting Millhaven under aliases and consultant credentials 3 or 4 times a year, watching my father get promoted to senior floor supervisor, watching my mother quietly hold the payroll department together through 2 difficult transitions, watching my sister Kim rise from an entry-level marketing coordinator to vice president, largely on the strength of her husband Trevor's growing influence as chief operating officer. I watched all of it the way you watch a house you used to live in from across the street, close enough to see the lights come on, far enough that nobody thinks to look up and notice you standing there. I also watched, more quietly and more carefully than anything else, my niece Sophie. Kim and Trevor's daughter, 16 years old by the time this story reaches its center. A girl with her grandmother Susan's sharp eyes and absolutely none of the family's appetite for cruelty. A girl who spent her study halls sketching bridges and staircases and buildings that did not exist yet, in notebooks she hid from her mother because Kim had already decided, out loud, more than once, that architecture was an impractical fantasy and that Sophie should study something sensible instead, something with guaranteed employment, something safe. I met Sophie for the first time 3 years ago, at a school fundraiser I attended under a false name as a supposed representative of a scholarship foundation, and something in the careful way she explained her sketch of a cantilevered library to a bored parent volunteer reminded me so completely of myself at that age that I had to excuse myself to the parking lot for several minutes before I trusted my own voice. I began, quietly and anonymously, funding a scholarship account in her name through a community foundation that had no visible connection to Ashcroft Capital. And I began finding small, deniable ways to be in her life. A woman named Claire who did freelance design consulting and happened to show up at the library on Tuesdays, willing to look over her drawings and ask her real questions the way Nana Ellie had once asked me real questions, on a porch with lemonade sweating in our hands. Sophie did not know I was her aunt. She knew me only as a kind woman named Claire who took her work seriously. And in the strange arithmetic of my life, that anonymous, honest relationship had become the single steadiest source of warmth I had left. She was, though neither of us fully understood it yet, the reason everything that happened over those 11 days needed to happen the way it happened. Carefully, deliberately, and with an ending that restored something rather than simply punished someone. It was 8 months before that anniversary gala when the first irregularity crossed my desk, buried inside a routine quarterly variance report that Daniel Reyes forwarded to me the way he forwarded everything, without comment, trusting me to notice what mattered. A logistics vendor called Meridian Freight Solutions had been billing Whitfield Industries at rates nearly 30% above regional market average for 18 consecutive months, and the contract renewal, oddly, had never once gone out for competitive bid, despite company policy requiring exactly that for any vendor relationship above $200,000 annually. I asked Daniel, in a quiet phone call from my Chicago office late one evening, who had signed off on that renewal. He told me the contract fell under operations, which meant it ultimately routed through Trevor Hale's office as Chief Operating Officer, and that Trevor had personally championed Meridian as, in his words, a reliable long-term partner worth paying a premium for. I did not say anything for a long moment. I was thinking about my sister, asleep beside a man who might be quietly bleeding the company that employed both her parents dry. And I was thinking about how thin the walls of that family really were, how little any of them actually knew about each other underneath the performance of closeness. I asked Daniel to pull Meridian's ownership records without alerting anyone in operations. It took our internal analyst, a sharp young controller named Priya Nair, who had no idea her research was being read by the company's true owner, less than a week to trace Meridian Freight Solutions back through 2 shell layers to a holding entity registered in Delaware, whose sole listed officer was a woman named Renata Hale, Trevor's sister. My stomach turned cold reading that name on the page, not because I was shocked that people like Trevor existed, but because I understood, instantly and completely, exactly what it meant for the people I still, against every instinct I had trained myself to suppress, could not stop loving from a distance. I sat alone in my Chicago office that night, long after the building had emptied out, the city lights scattered across the window behind me, a single desk lamp throwing a small circle of gold over the printout in front of me. Renata Hale, incorporated 4 years earlier, the same year Trevor Hale had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer, the timing so precise it felt less like coincidence and more like a blueprint someone had drawn up in advance and simply waited to execute. I remember running my thumb along the edge of that page, the way you touch something you already know is going to change your life before you have fully admitted it to yourself. I called Priya back at 9 that evening, later than I usually reached out, because I wanted to understand exactly how she had found what she found before I decided what to do with it. She walked me through it in the careful, methodical voice of someone who did excellent work and had no idea yet how much weight her findings actually carried. The Meridian invoices, she explained, were not simply inflated, they were structured, broken into amounts just under the $200,000 threshold that would have triggered a mandatory competitive bid, filed in a pattern that repeated with an almost mechanical regularity every quarter for 18 months. Whoever built this, Priya said, and I could hear her frowning through the phone, understood our internal controls well enough to walk right around every single one of them without ever technically breaking a rule on paper. I asked her whether she had a theory about who inside the company might have that level of understanding, and she was quiet for a moment before she answered. Honestly, Miss Winslow, it would have to be someone in operations leadership, someone who signs off on vendor relationships and also happens to know exactly where the audit thresholds sit. I do not want to speculate beyond that. I told her she did not need to speculate. I already knew. I simply had not yet decided what I intended to do with the knowing. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over you when you finally have proof of something you had already, quietly, suspected for years without ever letting yourself name it. I thought back, sitting in that office, to Trevor and Kim's wedding 6 years earlier. A lavish afternoon at a country club outside Millhaven that I had watched from a careful distance, seated near the back under an assumed identity as a distant cousin nobody bothered to interrogate too closely. I remembered Trevor's toast that day, glass raised, telling the room that he intended to give Kim a life bigger than anything this small town could offer her. And I remembered thinking, even then, before I had a single fact to support it, that a man who spoke about bigness with that particular hunger in his voice was a man who measured his own worth in things rather than in people. I had dismissed that instinct for years as nothing more than an old wound talking, the residue of a childhood spent watching my sister get chosen for everything, while I got chosen for nothing. And I had told myself, more than once, that resenting Trevor's confidence was simply another shape my own bitterness liked to take. Sitting in my office with Priya's printout in front of me, I understood that my instinct had not been bitterness at all. It had been observation, the same observation Nana Ellie had once taught me to trust on her porch, with the lemonade sweating in our hands. The ability to look past a person's performance and see the shape of what they were actually building underneath it. I opened the folder Nana Ellie had left me, the one with the yellowed photographs of Augustus Whitfield's workshop, and I found, tucked behind the newspaper clippings I had already read a dozen times, a single index card I had somehow overlooked in my grief the first time I went through it. In her small, careful handwriting, it read, "The men who took my father's company from him wore good suits and used the word partnership like a promise. Watch for that word. Watch for anyone who calls himself family and means ownership." I sat with that card for a long time, the paper soft with age between my fingers, and I understood that my grandmother had somehow, decades before any of this happened, already handed me the exact warning I would need to recognize Trevor Hale for what he was. I called Daniel Reyes the following morning, before the plant floor shift even started, and told him I wanted a complete forensic reconstruction of every vendor contract that had crossed Trevor's desk since his promotion. Not simply Meridian, because if a man was capable of building one shell company disguised as a trusted partner, he was very likely capable of building more than one. Daniel was quiet on the line for a moment, and then he said something that stayed with me through everything that followed. "You understand," he said carefully, "that if this is as bad as it sounds, it is going to touch your sister's entire life, not just his career." I told him I understood that completely, and that it was precisely because I understood it that I intended to move slowly enough to get every single detail right, rather than fast enough to feel better about myself in the moment. Priya's expanded review took another 6 weeks, working alongside a second forensic analyst Daniel brought in from an outside firm under strict confidentiality, a woman named Grace Okonkwo, who specialized in exactly this kind of shell vendor tracing and who had no personal or professional connection to anyone at Whitfield Industries. Together, they found 2 additional vendors beyond Meridian, a packaging supplier called Coastline Materials and a maintenance contractor called Iron Bridge Facilities Group, both tracing back through slightly different but structurally identical shell layers to entities controlled by members of Trevor's extended family, an uncle in one case, a college roommate turned silent partner in the other. The total figure, once Grace finished her reconciliation, came to $1,843,000 in overpayments across 3 years. Money that had been quietly bled out of the company's operating margins under the explanation Trevor had repeated at every quarterly board meeting, that rising raw material costs and unavoidable market pressure were simply the price of doing business in a difficult economy. I remember reading that final number on my laptop screen at 11 at night, alone in my apartment, and feeling something close to fury for the first time since this entire investigation began. Not because of the money itself, though the money mattered, but because I understood, with total clarity, that every dollar of it had been quietly subtracted from the raises, the equipment upgrades, and the job security of people like my own father, standing on that plant floor believing his company was simply struggling the way every company struggles sometimes. I thought, too, about Kim, asleep most nights beside a man she believed was building a bigger life for both of them, never once suspecting that the bigness he promised her at that country club toast was being financed by quietly stealing from her own parents' employer. I did not know yet, sitting there with Grace's reconciliation open in front of me, whether Kim had any knowledge of what her husband was doing. Every instinct I had told me she did not, that she was, in her own way, as much a person standing outside a locked room as the rest of us, but I understood that proving her innocence would matter every bit as much as proving Trevor's guilt, because I refused to let this unravel into a punishment that landed on someone who had done nothing wrong beyond loving the wrong man and believing him. It was during that same stretch of nights, going back through years of internal company memos Daniel had quietly pulled for me, that I found the proposal Trevor had begun quietly circulating to 2 sympathetic board members 8 months earlier, long before Priya ever flagged that first Meridian invoice. A proposal to explore what he called strategic manufacturing consolidation, language so carefully bureaucratic that it took me 3 full readings to understand what it actually meant. It meant closing the Millhaven plant. It meant moving production to a contract facility outside the country. It meant framing 340 families' livelihoods as a line item to be optimized. And it meant Trevor personally profiting from that optimization through a transition bonus structure buried 4 pages deep in an appendix nobody on the board had apparently bothered to read closely enough to question. I printed that appendix and set it on my desk beside Nana Ellie's index card. Watch for anyone who calls himself family and means ownership. And I sat there in the quiet of my apartment for a long time, feeling the full shape of what I was actually looking at settle over me. This was not simply a man skimming money from a company that happened to employ my parents. This was a man who had married into my family, sat at my mother's table, called my father by his first name at every holiday gathering, and was, at the exact same time, quietly constructing a plan that would end my father's career and hundreds of others alongside it, all while collecting a personal reward for the damage. I did not sleep much that night, and somewhere close to 3 in the morning, I found myself standing at my window, looking out over a city that had given me every single thing my family once told me I would never have. And I thought about my father's joke, the one about needing to be bailed out until I was 50, a joke he had not even delivered yet, though somewhere deep in my chest I already knew it was coming, because men like my father always found a way to make the same joke eventually, at the worst possible moment, in front of the largest possible audience. I thought about how strange it was that the family who had spent 2 decades treating me as the unreliable one, the unstable one, the one who could never be trusted to hold anything together, was now standing, without any of them knowing it, entirely inside the boundary of what I was quietly holding together for them. I closed my laptop somewhere near 4 in the morning, and I sat there in the dark for a long time before I let myself feel anything at all. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like mine worth telling. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the cold satisfaction people imagine you feel when you finally catch the person who has been quietly hurting the ones you love. I felt exhausted and grieved and strangely responsible because I understood that whatever Trevor Hale was doing to this company, my parents' entire retirement, my sister's entire household, and Sophie's entire future were sitting directly in its path. I asked Priya to keep pulling the thread, carefully, under the cover story that Ashcroft Capital was conducting a routine vendor efficiency audit ahead of the company's upcoming anniversary year, and she did, without ever once suspecting that the shadowy, controlling shareholder she was quietly reporting to shared a childhood bedroom with the very woman married to the man she was investigating. Over the following weeks, what emerged was worse than a single inflated contract. It was a pattern, deliberate and expanding, and understanding its full shape would take the better part of 2 months, months during which I still had to fly home to Millhaven, sit at family dinners, and absorb my mother's quiet disappointment and my father's loud jokes as if none of it had changed anything at all. The dinner that mattered most happened on a Sunday in early spring, at my parents' house, the same kitchen table where my father had once told me some people were simply not built for stability. I had come home under my real name that weekend, ostensibly for my mother's birthday, still holding inside me the knowledge of Meridian Freight Solutions and the growing shape of what Trevor Hale was doing to the company that employed both the people currently passing me the mashed potatoes. My mother spent most of that dinner talking about Kim's promotion, about the vacation house Kim and Trevor were considering in Michigan, about how proud they all were of what Kim had built. At one point, almost as an afterthought, she turned to me and asked what I was doing these days for work, and when I told her, carefully, that I did investment consulting, my father laughed into his wine glass and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Consulting. That is what people say when they do not have a real job." Kim smiled into her plate. Trevor did not even look up. I did not defend myself. I had stopped defending myself years earlier, somewhere around the time I realized that no evidence I offered would ever be enough, because the verdict had never actually been about evidence. It had been decided the day I fell apart at 22, and nothing I could say at a dinner table was going to overturn a ruling my family had spent 2 decades treating as settled law. What I noticed instead, sitting at that table, was Sophie, 16 years old, quiet at the far end near the kitchen door, pushing food around her plate while her mother described, in loving detail, the private school Kim wanted her to attend for a business preparatory program, one that had no art track, no design track, nothing remotely resembling the cantilevered libraries Sophie sketched in notebooks she hid under her mattress. I watched Sophie's shoulders curl inward with every sentence, the exact posture I remembered from my own childhood at that same table, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever I was building toward, it could not simply be about punishing Trevor or humbling my parents. It had to be about her, too. It had to give something back. I left that dinner early, claiming a work call, and sat in my rental car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I thought about Nana Ellie's folder, the yellowed photographs, the note in her careful handwriting. Some things are worth taking back. I understood, finally, sitting in that dark driveway under a sky full of stars my family never once looked up to notice, that she had not only meant the company, she had meant Sophie's future too, and mine, and whatever quiet dignity had been stripped from all 3 of us by people who mistook cruelty for honesty and called it looking out for the family. Over the following weeks, Priya Nair's audit widened into a full forensic reconstruction, one I quietly directed through Daniel Reyes, without either of them fully grasping how personally invested their controlling shareholder actually was in the outcome. What we found was not a single mistake. It was architecture. Trevor Hale had spent nearly 3 years constructing a network of shell vendors, routing inflated contracts through Meridian, and 2 smaller entities also linked to his sister Renata, skimming an estimated $1.8 million in inflated billing over that period, money that had been quietly bled out of operating margins the board had been told were shrinking due to, in Trevor's own quarterly presentations, rising raw material costs and unavoidable market pressure. Worse than the theft itself, and this was the piece that turned my grief into something colder and more focused, was the plan Trevor had been quietly building toward for the coming board cycle. Internal memos Priya recovered showed Trevor preparing a formal recommendation to relocate the company's manufacturing operations to a contract facility in Mexico, framed publicly as a cost-saving modernization initiative that would preserve corporate headquarters jobs while eliminating what he called legacy production inefficiencies. In practice, it would eliminate the Millhaven plant floor entirely, displacing roughly 340 workers, including my father, including men and women who had given that plant 35 years of their lives. Trevor's own compensation package, buried in a separate memo to the board's compensation committee, included a transition bonus tied directly to cost savings realized from the relocation, a bonus that would functionally reward him personally and substantially for destroying the very jobs his own father-in-law had spent his entire working life performing. I sat with that memo open on my laptop for a long time one night in my Chicago apartment, and I found myself laughing, once, without any humor in it at all, because I finally understood the full, ugly shape of what I was dealing with. This was not simply a man skimming money from a company. This was a man planning to profit personally from destroying the livelihood of the very family that had, without ever knowing it, spent years insulting me for supposedly never learning how to hold a job. I would need help to stop him properly, and to stop him in a way that could never quietly be undone in some closed-door settlement 6 months later. I would need documentation airtight enough to survive a board challenge, a legal strategy that could withstand Trevor's inevitable counterattack, and, most importantly, I would need someone inside that plant, someone the workers trusted, someone who had watched Trevor operate up close for years and already sensed, in his gut, that something about the man did not add up. There was exactly one person who fit that description, and he had known my father for 30 years without ever once suspecting how deeply his loyalty was about to matter. His name was Walt Higgins, and he had worked the Whitfield plant floor for 38 years, longer than my father, long enough to remember the company under its previous ownership, long enough to have quietly clashed with Trevor Hale on at least 4 separate occasions over safety corners Walt believed operations was cutting to hit quarterly numbers. Daniel Reyes had flagged Walt to me over a year earlier as one of the most respected voices on the floor, a man other workers listened to before they listened to any supervisor. And I had been watching him from a careful distance ever since, waiting to understand whether he was someone I could trust with a piece of the truth. I met Walt for the first time under the name C.J. Winslow in a diner off Route 9 outside Millhaven, in a booth Daniel had arranged under the cover story of an ownership group conducting employee sentiment interviews ahead of the anniversary celebration. Walt was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with a gray mustache and hands permanently roughened by 4 decades of machine work, and he studied me for a long moment before he said a single word. The way men like him study anyone new who claims to have real authority over their livelihoods. "You are younger than I expected," Walt said, stirring his coffee slowly. Ownership group usually sends somebody older, somebody who looks like they have never actually worked a shift in their life. I have worked plenty of shifts, I told him, which was true, though not in the way he assumed. I told him, carefully, that Ashcroft Capital was conducting a confidential review of certain operational decisions ahead of the anniversary, and that his name had come up repeatedly as someone whose judgment the workforce trusted. I did not tell him why. I did not tell him whose father he had spent decades standing shoulder to shoulder with on that floor. Walt set his coffee down and looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that made me understand exactly why other workers listened to him before they listened to their supervisors. "You want to know about Hale," he said. It was not a question. I did not answer immediately, and he took my silence as confirmation. Man's been cutting corners on maintenance schedules for 2 years, blaming budget. Meanwhile, he drives a car worth more than my house. Some of us noticed a while back. Nobody with any power ever asked. I asked him then whether he would be willing to help me build a case, quietly, discreetly, without revealing to anyone on the floor, including my own family, that an investigation was underway. I told him it could take months. I told him it could cost him his job if it went wrong, if Trevor found out before we were ready, if the board sided with operations the way boards sometimes did when a company was performing well enough on paper to make nobody want to look too closely underneath it. Walt was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. And then he said something that I have carried with me ever since. The diner around us kept moving in its own small, ordinary rhythm while I waited. A waitress refilling coffee 2 booths over, a bell above the door jingling as a trucker stepped out into the gray afternoon, the low hum of a radio playing something soft behind the counter. I remember focusing on those small sounds deliberately, the way I had trained myself to focus on small, controllable details whenever a moment mattered too much to simply sit inside without an anchor. Rain had started against the window somewhere during our conversation, thin and steady, streaking the glass beside our booth, and I watched it for a moment rather than watching Walt, giving him the space his silence seemed to need. I understood, sitting there, that I was asking this man to gamble something he had spent 38 years building, a reputation on that floor as steady, careful, and above the kind of politics that got other men fired. I understood, too, that if I had misjudged him, if Walt Higgins turned out to be the kind of man who reported strange conversations with strangers back to his superiors out of loyalty or fear or simple self-preservation, everything I had built toward over the preceding months could collapse before it had ever truly begun. Renata Cole had warned me, weeks earlier, that recruiting an internal ally always carried this exact risk, that the very quality that made someone trustworthy, a deep, old loyalty to the people around them, could just as easily run in the wrong direction if I picked the wrong person to test it on. I had not picked Walt carelessly. Daniel Reyes had given me 11 names during our earliest conversations about who commanded real respect on that floor, and I had spent the better part of 2 months quietly researching every one of them before narrowing the list down to 3, and then, finally, to 1. I had read through years of internal safety incident reports with Walt's careful, handwritten notes attached, watched a grainy security recording from a company town hall 2 years earlier, where Walt had stood up, uninvited, and asked Trevor Hale directly why the second shift maintenance budget had been cut by 11%, while executive travel expenses had risen by nearly double that amount. Trevor had brushed the question aside that day with practiced ease, and Walt had simply sat back down, unsatisfied, the way a man sits down when he has decided a fight is not yet worth losing his job over, but has not forgotten the question either. That kind of patience, I had come to believe, was rarer and more valuable than any single act of open defiance could ever be. Nana Ellie used to say that the loudest person in a room was very rarely the most dangerous one, that real danger and real loyalty both tended to live quietly in the people who noticed everything and said almost nothing, waiting for the moment when speaking would actually change something instead of simply making them feel better for having spoken. Sitting across from Walt in that diner, watching him turn his coffee cup slowly between two roughened hands, I understood that I was looking at exactly the kind of person she had once described to me on that porch, and I found myself hoping, more than I had hoped for almost anything in years, that my instinct about him was correct. I thought, too, in that stretched, uncertain silence, about how strange it was that I had learned to read a stranger's character with more confidence than I had ever learned to read my own family's, and I understood, distantly, that this was not an accident. A family that spends 20 years training you to distrust your own instincts about yourself will very often, without meaning to, sharpen those same instincts toward everyone else instead, because survival requires you to get very good at reading the room, even when the room refuses to read you back. I had built an entire career on that particular skill. I had never once been grateful for how I acquired it until that exact moment, watching Walt Higgins decide in real time whether to trust me. Walt's history with Whitfield Industries ran deeper than his personnel file suggested. Deeper, in fact, than even Daniel Reyes had fully understood when he flagged the name to me. I learned later, piecing it together slowly through conversations over the following months, that Walt's own father had worked the original Whitfield workshop floor under Augustus Whitfield himself, decades before the ownership changed hands, back when the company was still small enough that the founder knew every worker's name and the names of their children. Walt had grown up hearing his father describe those early years the way some families describe a lost home, with a particular ache reserved only for things taken rather than things simply outgrown. When the ownership changed hands the first time, in the years after Augustus Whitfield lost control of the company, his own family history and mine were quietly entangled in. Walt's father had stayed on under the new management, watching, according to what Walt eventually told me, good decisions replaced one by one with decisions that served spreadsheets instead of people. Walt himself had started on that same floor at 19 years old, in the very same building his father had worked in, carrying forward an inherited loyalty to a company that had, in its truest form, stopped existing before Walt was even old enough to remember it clearly. I understood, hearing that story later, why the phrase Gus Whitfield's grandson had come out of Walt's mouth with such immediate, practiced bitterness. He had been waiting, in some quiet corner of himself, to watch that particular history repeat for a very long time. The waitress returned to our booth in the middle of that long silence, refilling my water glass and asking, in the easy, unbothered voice of someone who had refilled 1,000 glasses in that same diner, whether we needed anything else. Walt shook his head without looking up from his coffee cup, and I did the same, and she moved on, and the small interruption seemed to loosen something in him, because his shoulders dropped slightly, the careful, guarded posture he had held since he first sat down easing just a fraction. I considered, in that pause, whether to say anything more, whether to push him gently toward an answer the way I might push a hesitant board member toward a decision in a Chicago conference room, and I decided, deliberately, against it. Some silences need to be filled to move a conversation forward. Others need to be respected, left alone entirely, allowed to do their own slow work without interference. And I understood, watching Walt's face in the gray afternoon light coming through that rain-streaked window, that this was the second kind. I had learned that distinction the hard way, across years of watching my own family fill every uncomfortable silence with cruelty rather than patience, and I had promised myself long ago that I would never build anything, a company or a relationship or an alliance, on that same impatience. Outside, the rain thickened slightly, drumming a little harder against the diner's tin awning, and somewhere behind the counter, the radio shifted to a slower song I did not recognize, something with a low, steady bass line that seemed to match the rhythm of Walt's thinking better than any words could have. I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, of Nana Ellie's porch again, of lemonade sweating in 2 glasses, of a woman who had once looked at a 9-year-old's sketchbook and asked real questions instead of polite ones. And I understood, sitting there, that I was trying, in my own way, to become the kind of person for Walt Higgins that she had once been for me, someone who extended trust first, before it had been fully earned, because sometimes that is the only way trust is ever built at all. Walt finally set his coffee cup down flat against the table, the small clink of ceramic against formica landing with more weight than the sound itself should have carried, and he looked up at me directly for the first time since the waitress had come and gone. Something in his expression had settled, the wariness still present but no longer dominant, replaced by something steadier, more deliberate, the look of a man who had finally finished weighing a decision he had already, on some level, made weeks earlier without admitting it to himself. "You want to know why I am even considering this?" he said, his voice low, not quite a question, and I nodded once, giving him room to keep going rather than answering for him. "It is not because I trust your outfit," he continued. "I do not know your outfit from a hole in the ground. It is because I have spent 38 years watching good people get quietly squeezed by men who talk about efficiency and mean their own bank accounts, and every single time, by the time anybody with real power finally noticed, it was already too late to matter. You are the first person from an ownership group who has ever sat across from me and just listened, instead of already having an answer prepared." I told him, honestly, that I had learned the value of listening the hard way, in rooms where nobody had ever once listened to me either, and something in that small admission seemed to land with him more than any promise or guarantee I could have offered instead. He studied me for another long moment, and then, finally, he reached for his coffee cup one last time, turned it slowly between his roughened hands the way he had throughout our entire conversation, and set it back down. And I understood, watching him, that whatever he said next would decide everything that followed. "I have 38 years in that plant," he said. "I watched Gus Whitfield's grandson sell it out from under decent people once already, a long time ago, before your outfit ever showed up. I am not watching it happen twice because some fool in a $5,000 suit wants a bigger bonus." He extended his rough hand across the table, and I shook it, and in that moment, without either of us fully realizing it, we became allies in something far larger than either of us had originally understood, something that reached all the way back to a manila envelope and a note in careful handwriting that said, "Some things are worth taking back." Over the following 4 months, Walt became my eyes on the plant floor in ways Priya's spreadsheets never could reach. He noted which maintenance requests Trevor personally delayed or denied. He quietly gathered names of workers willing to speak, off the record, about safety concerns operations had dismissed. He never once asked why an anonymous ownership representative cared this much about a mid-sized furniture plant in northern Ohio, and I never once told him, because the truth would have required explaining an entire family history neither of us had time to unpack while we were building a case against a man actively planning to destroy 340 livelihoods for a bonus. I've brought in outside legal counsel during that same period, a sharp, unshowy attorney named Renata Cole, no relation to Trevor's sister, despite the coincidence of names, who specialized in corporate fraud and shareholder actions, and who had handled 2 previous matters for Ashcroft Capital with a discretion I trusted completely. Renata reviewed Priya's forensic findings, Walt's documented safety concerns, and the board memos regarding the Mexico relocation plan, and told me, in her characteristically blunt way, that we had more than enough to remove Trevor Hale from his position for cause, recover damages through litigation against the shell vendors, and block the relocation vote entirely, provided we moved with precision and did not tip our hand before every piece was in place. "There is one thing I need to understand," Renata said to me, during a late meeting in her Chicago office, papers spread across the conference table between us. "You have controlling authority here. You could remove this man quietly tomorrow with a private board resolution, and nobody outside this room would ever know the details. Why are you building towards something bigger?" I did not answer her right away. I thought about my father's toast, not yet delivered but somehow already inevitable, the joke about needing to be bailed out until I was 50. I thought about my mother's stiff hug at Nana Ellie's funeral. I thought about Sophie's shoulders curling inward at that dinner table. And I told Renata the truth, which was that some debts are not only financial, and some corrections are not only legal, and I intended to collect on both kinds at the same time, in front of every witness who had ever underestimated me. The anniversary gala had been on the company calendar for over a year by the time all of this converged, a public celebration of Whitfield Industries' 75th year in business, complete with press coverage, employee recognition awards, and a formal program that Daniel Reyes, as CEO, would host. It was, we realized during a strategy session in Renata's office, the single largest audience the company would ever assemble in one room. Employees, their families, local press, board members, community leaders, all gathered under one roof, all watching. It was also, not incidentally, the exact venue where my father had already been selected months earlier to receive an Employee of Excellence Award for his 32 years of service. I made the decision, sitting in that conference room with Renata and Daniel on a video call, to time the reveal to that exact night. Not out of theater for its own sake, though I will not pretend some part of me did not want an audience for a truth I had swallowed for 20 years, but because it was the only setting large enough, public enough, and undeniable enough to accomplish everything at once, exposing Trevor before the board could be pressured into a quiet settlement that let him walk away with his bonus intact, and revealing my true identity in a way that could never be dismissed, minimized, or quietly forgotten by a family that had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of forgetting me on purpose. There was one more piece I needed to secure before that night arrived, one that had nothing to do with fraud or board votes or bonuses, and everything to do with the note in Nana Ellie's careful handwriting. I opened an independent trust account in Sophie's name, funded directly from my own personal holdings, rather than routed anonymously through the Community Foundation scholarship, structured so that on her 18th birthday, regardless of what happened to her parents' marriage, her father's career, or her mother's opinions about impractical fantasies, she would have 4 years of architecture school fully paid, untouchable by anyone, protected the way Nana Ellie had once protected me with a manila envelope and $40,000 I had turned into everything I now controlled. I told Renata I wanted that trust finalized before the gala, regardless of how the rest of the evening unfolded, because if everything else that night went wrong, if the board somehow sided with Trevor, if my family's reaction proved even worse than I imagined, I needed to know that at least one good thing had already been made permanent and untouchable. Renata finalized the paperwork 9 days before the anniversary. 2 days after that, I flew back to Millhaven for the final round of preparation, carrying inside me a folder of evidence, a legal strategy built to withstand any challenge, and a decision I had now been sitting with for the better part of a year. that the woman who had spent her whole childhood apologizing for taking up space in that family was not going to walk into that ballroom small. I did not yet know exactly how the night would unfold, only that whatever came next, I would not be the one flinching when it was over. The week before the gala moved in the strange, compressed way that important weeks always seem to move, full and empty at once, every hour thick with preparation, and every day somehow gone before I had processed the one before it. Daniel Reyes and I met twice more in person, finalizing the exact sequence of the evening's formal program, the moment in the schedule where the anniversary remarks would transition from employee recognition into what Daniel would introduce, carefully and without drama, as a few words from the company's controlling shareholder. Renata Cole spent that week preparing the board resolution removing Trevor Hale for cause, built entirely around Priya's forensic documentation and the Shell vendor paper trail, structured so it could be executed the moment the board reconvened, whether that happened publicly at the gala itself or privately the following morning, depending on how the evening unfolded. She also prepared, at my specific request, a parallel civil action against Meridian Freight Solutions and its associated Shell entities, seeking recovery of the full $1.8 million in inflated billing, plus damages, a filing time to become public record the same week as the gala. Walt Higgins spent that week doing something quieter and, in its own way, more important than any of the legal maneuvering. He began, carefully and without revealing why, letting a handful of the most trusted senior floor workers know that changes were coming to operations leadership, changes that would protect their jobs rather than threaten them, without naming names or details he had promised to keep confidential. He told me later that some of the older workers, the ones who remembered the plant under previous ownership, had simply nodded and said they had been waiting a long time for someone to finally do something about that man. I spent part of that week doing something I had not expected to need to do, which was preparing myself emotionally for a confrontation I had spent years anticipating in the abstract and had never once actually rehearsed in the specific. I sat alone in my hotel room 3 nights before the gala, running through every version of how my father might react, how my mother might react, how Kim's face might change in the instant she understood that the sister she had spent a lifetime dismissing controlled the very paycheck her household depended on. And I found that no amount of rehearsal fully prepared me for what those faces would actually look like. Because I had never, not once in my adult life, allowed myself to picture my family looking at me with anything other than the same tired disappointment. 2 days before the gala, I drove out to the library where I had been meeting Sophie under my false identity for 3 years, and I told her, gently, that I would not be able to meet her there as often going forward, because some things in my life were about to become more complicated. She looked up from her sketchbook, alarmed, and asked if she had done something wrong. I told her, as honestly as I could without revealing everything, that she had done nothing wrong at all, that she was, in fact, one of the best things in my entire life, and that whatever happened over the coming days, I needed her to remember that someone out there had always believed her drawings were worth taking seriously, long before anyone else did. She did not fully understand what I meant. I did not expect her to, yet. The night before the gala, I called Walt one final time from a quiet corner of my hotel room to confirm the last details of the plan. He asked me, near the end of the call, a question he had clearly been sitting with for weeks. "Miss Winslow," he said, "can I ask you something personal? Why does a woman who could quietly fire this man tomorrow morning with one signature want to do it in front of the whole town instead?" I was quiet for a moment, and then I told him the truth, the same truth I had given Renata weeks earlier. "Some corrections need witnesses," I said, "or the people who caused the damage simply rewrite the story afterward, and the people who were hurt never get to watch the ledger balance in real time." Walt did not say anything for a long moment, and then he said quietly, "Whoever hurt you before this company, I hope they are in that room." I told him they would be, all of them. The morning of the gala arrived cold and clear, the kind of crisp Ohio morning that Nana Ellie used to say felt like the world clearing its throat before saying something important. I woke early in my hotel room outside Millhaven and sat by the window for a long time before I did anything else, watching the sun come up over a town that had shaped me into someone it never bothered to understand. And I thought, not for the first time that week, about how strange it was that the same soil that grew my family's cruelty had also, somehow, grown Nana Ellie's kindness, Walt's loyalty, and Sophie's quiet, careful drawings of buildings that did not exist yet. Renata called me at 9 that morning to confirm the board resolution was finalized and ready for execution the instant we needed it, and that the civil filing against Meridian Freight Solutions would go live in the public record at exactly 6 that evening, timed precisely to the moment the gala's cocktail hour would be underway, so that any board member or local reporter checking their phone during the reception would already be seeing the first ripples of what was coming before the formal program even began. Daniel Reyes called an hour later to confirm the run of show, the exact minute in the evening schedule where he would introduce the controlling shareholders' remarks, immediately following the employee recognition segment, immediately following, though he did not phrase it this way and did not need to, my father's toast. I spent the afternoon at a small tailor's shop 2 towns over, being fitted for a dress I had ordered weeks earlier and never once tried on. A single, sharply tailored charcoal gown. Simple, expensive in the way that only looks expensive to people who already understand what quality costs. Nothing like the understated grays and beiges I had worn for years to stay invisible in rooms full of people who had already decided what I was worth. The tailor adjusted the hem and asked if I was attending something special that evening. I told her, honestly, that I was attending the most important evening of my adult life. She smiled and told me I looked like a woman who already knew that. I arrived at the ballroom that evening at exactly 6:15, 45 minutes before the formal program was scheduled to begin, and I stood near a side entrance for a long moment before walking in, watching through the glass doors as the room filled with people I had once shared a childhood with. People who would spend the next 2 hours believing they understood exactly who was and was not important in that room. I thought, standing there in my charcoal dress, about the manila envelope, about the note in careful handwriting, about 38 years on a plant floor, about a girl hiding sketchbooks under her mattress, and I walked through the doors before I could talk myself into waiting any longer. I found my seat at a table near the back, not the family table where my parents and Kim and Trevor sat in comfortable proximity to the head of the room, but a modest round table populated mostly by mid-level staff who did not recognize me and had no particular reason to look twice. I ordered a glass of water instead of wine, because I wanted, more than almost anything else that night, to remember every single detail with total clarity. Across the room, I watched my father adjust his rented tuxedo jacket for the 4th time, practicing, I imagined, the exact cadence of the toast he had clearly been rehearsing for weeks, unaware that the daughter he was about to humiliate in front of 300 people held the single largest ownership stake in the company that had just spent 32 years employing him. The evening's formal program began precisely on schedule, at 7 o'clock, with Daniel Reyes stepping up to a small podium under a banner reading, "Whitfield Industries, 75 years," and welcoming the room with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent 2 decades running manufacturing operations and understood exactly how to make an audience feel at ease before he asked anything of them. He spoke for several minutes about the company's history, about Augustus Whitfield's original workshop, about the generations of Millhaven families who had built their lives around this company's success, and I watched my mother nod along, unaware that the man discussing her family's shame with such gentle reverence answered in every meaningful sense to me. Then Daniel announced the Employee of Excellence Award and called my father's name, and the room applauded warmly as Richard Bennett walked to the podium in his rented tuxedo, holding the small crystal plaque, and began the toast I had already watched him rehearse a dozen times in my imagination, without ever once knowing exactly how it would land when it finally arrived for real. I sat perfectly still at my table near the back, water glass cool against my palm, and listened as my father built toward the joke about people who never learned how to hold a job, the joke about needing to be bailed out until 50, the joke that landed across the room in that same uncertain, obligatory laughter I remembered from every family gathering of my adult life. My father did not stop at the joke about being bailed out until 50. He let the laughter settle, and then, warming to the room's attention the way he always warmed to any room's attention, he kept going, because a man who has spent 32 years believing himself the reasonable one rarely knows when to leave a wound alone. "We used to sit up nights wondering what we did wrong," he said, shaking his head with a rueful little smile that the room read as self-deprecating charm. "Susan and I gave both our girls the same upbringing, same house, same rules, same chances. One of them turned that into a career people respect. The other one turned it into a decade of phone calls asking us not to worry so much." A ripple of sympathetic laughter moved through the tables again, softer this time, the kind reserved for a father everyone assumed had simply done his best with a difficult child. I felt that particular sentence land somewhere under my ribs, the same place it had always landed since I was 22 years old sitting at that kitchen table. And I noticed, distantly, the specific physical sensation of it, a tightening across my chest, a slight cooling in my hands where they rested around the water glass. I had cataloged that sensation so many times over the years that it no longer frightened me the way it once had. It simply arrived, familiar and unwelcome, like weather you have learned to dress for without ever learning to like. I let my eyes move briefly around the nearby tables, cataloging reactions the way I had trained myself to catalog everything in a room that mattered. A woman 2 tables over, someone from the accounting department I recognized vaguely from company records, glanced toward her husband with a small, uncomfortable frown, the particular expression of someone who found the joke unkind, but had decided, as most people in most rooms decide, that it was not her place to say so out loud. A younger man near the bar, one of the newer hires in logistics, simply looked confused, uncertain whether he was supposed to laugh, glancing sideways at his neighbors for a cue. I thought, in that stretched, suspended moment, about every single version of this scene I had already lived through in smaller rooms across 20 years. The same joke in different clothing, delivered at Thanksgiving tables and birthday dinners and, once, humiliatingly, at my own engagement party before Peter ever left. My father raising a glass to toast the happy couple and somehow finding a way, even then, to mention that he hoped I had finally found some stability. I had absorbed that sentence in front of 40 guests that night, too, in a rented function hall 2 hours from Millhaven, and I remembered exactly how it felt, the particular public nature of private cruelty, the way a joke delivered to a crowd cannot be argued with the way a private insult can, because arguing only proves the joke correct, only confirms that you are, in fact, too sensitive, too dramatic, too much exactly the thing they already decided you were. I understood, sitting in that ballroom 17 years later in a charcoal dress that cost more than my father's entire rented tuxedo, that this was the last time that particular trick would ever work on me. I understood it the way you understand a fact you have known for months arriving, finally, in your body, rather than simply your mind. A difference that matters more than people who have never lived it tend to realize. Knowing a thing intellectually and finally feeling it settle into your bones are not the same experience. And I felt, in that exact moment, the second one arrive. My father closed his toast the way he always closed his toasts, raising his glass toward the head table, toward my mother, toward Kim and Trevor, and saying, with real warmth this time, that he was the luckiest man in Millhaven to have built a life surrounded by people who understood the value of hard work. He did not once look toward the back of the room where I sat. He had no reason to. As far as he knew, his younger daughter was somewhere in Chicago, between jobs again, probably, unreachable and unremarkable, exactly where she had always been in his accounting of the family's success. The room applauded, warmly, generously, the specific applause people give a man who has just been handed a plaque and has said something that made them feel, briefly, grateful for their own families by comparison. I did not applaud. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, water glass sweating faintly against the tablecloth, and I let myself feel, one final time, the full weight of every dinner table, every holiday, every quiet aside about my instability that had built, brick by brick, into the woman sitting in that chair. And then, quietly, deliberately, I set that weight down. Not the memory of it. I do not believe memories like that ever fully set themselves down, no matter how much distance or success or vindication eventually arrives to soften them. But the particular grip it had held over how I moved through a room, the instinct to shrink, to apologize, to make myself smaller so the joke would land more comfortably, that I set down, deliberately, in the space of a single held breath. The way you set down a bag you have carried so long your shoulder has forgotten what it feels like to be free of the weight. I thought, one last time, of Nana Ellie's porch, of lemonade sweating in 2 glasses, of a woman who had once told a 9-year-old that she was not a failure. She was simply the only one in the family who had ever looked at her when she spoke. I thought of Sophie's sketchbooks hidden under a mattress 3 streets away from where I sat. I thought of Walt Higgins turning a coffee cup slowly between roughened hands in a diner off Route 9, deciding, that gray, rainy afternoon, to trust a stranger because she had finally, for once, simply listened. I thought of all of it in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, the particular compression of time that arrives only at the hinge points of a life. And then I let the thinking go entirely, because the next part required nothing from my memory at all. It required only my composure, my clarity, and the folder of truth I had spent 11 months quietly assembling for exactly this room, on exactly this night. I did not flinch. I had trained myself for 20 years not to flinch at exactly this moment, and the training held, even now, even here, even with everything I knew sitting quietly inside me like a held breath. What I did instead, as my father lowered his plaque and accepted the room's applause, was glance once toward Daniel Reyes at the side of the podium and watch him check his watch, and understand, in that small, precise gesture, that 11 days of preparation and, in truth, 5 years of careful, silent ownership were about to converge in the next several minutes into something my family would never be able to unsee. Daniel returned to the podium as the applause for my father settled, and thanked him warmly for his 3 decades of service. And then, in the same easy, unhurried voice he had used all evening, said the words that would end, forever, the version of my life my family believed they understood. "Before we continue this evening's program," he said, "I want to take a moment to introduce someone many of you have heard of, but very few of you have actually met. Whitfield Industries would not exist in its current form, would not have survived the transition 5 years ago, and would not be celebrating this milestone tonight without the vision and the discretion of our controlling shareholder. I would like to invite the managing partner of Ashcroft Capital to say a few words. Ladies and gentlemen, C.J. Winslow." For 1 full second, nothing happened at all. The room simply waited. the way rooms wait for someone to walk to a podium, 300 faces turning politely toward whatever direction seemed most likely, and I rose from my chair at the back table, smoothed the front of my charcoal dress, and began walking toward the front of the ballroom, past tables full of people who had known me my entire life and were, in this exact moment, still looking everywhere except directly at me. Because it had genuinely not occurred to a single one of them yet that the daughter they had dismissed for 20 years might be the very person Daniel Reyes had just called to the podium. I watched it happen in stages, the way you watch weather change across an open field. First in my mother's face, a small furrow of confusion as she turned in her seat and saw me walking toward the front. Then a flicker of something closer to recognition, quickly suppressed, because surely this was some strange coincidence of names. Then in Kim's face, sharper and faster, her champagne-colored composure cracking just slightly at the corners as she leaned toward Trevor and whispered something I could not hear, but did not need to hear. And then, last of all, in my father's face, still standing near the podium with his crystal plaque, his easy pride draining out of him in real time as I climbed the 2 short steps and took my place at the microphone he had been standing behind only moments earlier. I looked out over that ballroom, 300 faces now fully, completely turned toward me. And for one long moment, I let the silence stretch. Not for theater, though I understood exactly how it would read to anyone watching, but because I needed, for my own sake, to feel the full weight of that room's attention landing on me without flinching, the way I had never once been allowed to feel it as a child. Then I spoke, in the same measured, unhurried voice I had used in 100 boardrooms, a voice that had nothing left to prove and everything left to say. "Thank you, Daniel," I said. "And thank you, everyone, for being part of this company's history tonight. I want to start with something personal, because I think it matters more than any figure I could put on a slide." I paused and found my mother's eyes across the room, wide and pale under the chandelier light. 75 years ago, a man named Augustus Whitfield built a small workshop in this town with his own 2 hands. And decades later, his family lost control of it, in circumstances that caused a wound in that family that never fully healed. I know that story better than almost anyone in this room, because Augustus Whitfield was my great-grandfather. And the wound his family carried is a wound I grew up watching, up close, without ever fully understanding it until much later in my life. A low murmur moved through the room, the sound 300 people make when they sense, all at once, that the ground beneath an evening has shifted, and I let it settle before continuing. 5 years ago, Ashcroft Capital acquired a controlling stake in this company. I made that acquisition personally, and I have run this company, quietly, from behind the name C.J. Winslow ever since. Tonight, for reasons that will become clear, I think it is time this room knew who has actually been standing behind that name. I paused, and I looked directly at my father, who had not moved from beside the podium, his crystal plaque still held loosely in one hand, his face the color of old paper. "My name," I said, "is Claire Josephine Bennett. Some of you know me as Richard and Susan Bennett's younger daughter, the one." And here my voice did not waver, did not rise, remained exactly as measured as it had been the entire time. Who, according to a toast given from this very podium not 10 minutes ago, never learned how to hold a job. I let that land, watching the color finish draining entirely from my father's face, watching my mother's hand fly up to cover her mouth, watching Kim go rigid in her chair beside a husband who had suddenly gone very, very still. You said I never learned how to hold a job. Tonight, every single person in this room is learning who holds theirs. The room did not applaud. The room simply sat, absolutely silent, 300 people processing in real time the collapse of a story they had all, in their own smaller ways, believed for years, that the loud man at the podium was the family's success story, and the quiet woman who had just taken the microphone from him was its failure. I let that silence hold for a long moment, because I understood, with total clarity, that the silence itself was doing work no words of mine could accomplish nearly as efficiently. I did not come up here tonight simply to correct a story, I continued, my voice steady, my hands, I noticed distantly, entirely without tremor. I came up here because there is something else this company needs to know tonight, something that affects every single family in this room whose livelihood depends on this plant continuing to operate here in Millhaven. I gestured, and on the large screen behind me, which Daniel had quietly prepared to display at exactly this moment, the first slide appeared. A simple organizational chart with a single name circled in red. Trevor Hale. I watched my sister's husband, sitting at the family table not 30 feet from where I stood, go rigid in a way that had nothing to do with confusion and everything to do with recognition. Over the past 8 months, I said, a forensic review of this company's vendor contracts uncovered a pattern of inflated billing routed through shell companies controlled by relatives of our chief operating officer, totaling approximately $1.8 million in overpayments concealed as rising operational costs. A gasp moved through several tables at once, the sound of employees who had absorbed years of budget-tightening lectures, now understanding exactly where that missing money had actually gone. That same review, I continued, my voice hardening slightly, though I kept it level, kept it controlled, kept it the way I had trained myself to stay controlled through every confrontation of my adult life. Uncovered a proposal, prepared by Mr. Hale for presentation to this board next quarter, to relocate this facility's manufacturing operations out of Millhaven entirely, eliminating approximately 340 local jobs in exchange for a personal transition bonus tied directly to the cost savings his own family members had already been quietly extracting from this company for years. The room did not stay silent this time. It broke into a low, furious murmur, employees turning to each other, turning toward the family table, turning, some of them, toward my father, whose entire career had been spent on that plant floor, and who now sat utterly still beside my mother, staring at the son-in-law he had spent years praising at family dinners as the smart one, the one who had really made something of himself. I raised one hand slightly, not for silence exactly, but for the room's attention, and it settled, gradually, into something tense and waiting. As of this evening, I said, Trevor Hale has been removed from his position as Chief Operating Officer of Whitfield Industries, effective immediately, by unanimous resolution of the Board of Directors. A civil action seeking full recovery of the misappropriated funds plus damages was filed this afternoon and became part of the public record at 6 o'clock this evening. The proposed relocation of this facility has been permanently withdrawn from board consideration. I paused and let my eyes move slowly across the room, across 300 faces that had spent an entire evening believing they understood exactly how tonight would go. Every job in this plant is safe. That was never actually in question once I understood what was happening here. It simply required someone with the authority and the will to stop it. I want to describe, carefully, what happened at the family table over the next several minutes, because it is the part of that night I have replayed most often in the years since, not out of cruelty, but because it taught me something about the difference between people who collapse under consequences and people who somehow, even in collapse, still try to protect themselves first. Trevor Hale stood up first, his chair scraping loudly against the ballroom floor, his face a mask of practiced outrage, rapidly curdling into something closer to panic. "This is absurd," he said, loud enough to carry, though his voice cracked slightly on the second word. "These are unsubstantiated allegations, and I intend to pursue every legal avenue available to me." Daniel Reyes stepped forward at that moment, calm and immovable in the way that only comes from having watched enough boardroom crises to know exactly how they end. "The board resolution has already been executed, Trevor," he said. "The documentation is thorough, and it has already been reviewed by outside counsel and the full board. You are welcome to pursue whatever legal counsel you choose. I would recommend retaining your own attorney immediately, and not Renata Cole's firm, given the obvious conflict." A ripple of something almost like laughter moved through a few tables near the front, quickly suppressed, the particular laughter of people watching a bully finally meet consequences he cannot bluff his way out of. I watched two men in plain dark suits enter through the ballroom's side doors at exactly that moment, moving without hurry toward the family table, and I felt something in my chest tighten. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the strange, heavy weight of watching a consequence you set in motion finally arrive in physical form. They identified themselves quietly to Trevor as investigators with the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit, informed him that a formal fraud investigation had been opened based on documentation referred to their office earlier that week by Renata Cole's firm, and asked him to step outside with them to discuss the matter further. Trevor's face, under the chandelier light, had gone from red to a gray so complete it matched the tablecloths. Kim did not stand. She sat frozen beside her husband's empty chair as the investigators led him toward the side exit, her champagne gown suddenly looking, under that same unforgiving light, less like elegance and more like costume. And when she finally turned toward the podium, toward me, her face held an expression I had genuinely never seen on her before in 37 years of being her sister. Something raw and unrehearsed and entirely without its usual armor. I did not look away from her. I had spent too many years being the one who looked away first. My mother rose slowly from her seat, one hand still pressed against her mouth, and for a moment I thought she might walk toward the podium, though she did not. She simply stood there, swaying slightly, staring up at me with an expression that mixed shock and grief, and something else I could not immediately name. Something that looked almost like recognition of a person she had never actually bothered to meet. My father remained seated, his crystal plaque now resting forgotten on the tablecloth in front of him, staring at me with a slack, stunned expression that made him look, for the first time in my entire life, smaller than the room around him. I did not gloat. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters, and because it was harder than I expected. Some part of me, the part that had absorbed 20 years of jokes about needing to be bailed out, wanted very badly to stand at that podium and simply let the silence stretch forever. Let them sit in it. Let them understand exactly how small they had made me feel, for exactly as long as I now made them feel small. But I had promised myself, in that hotel room 3 nights earlier, that I would not become the kind of person who mistook cruelty for justice, and I held to that promise, even as every old wound in me screamed for more. "I want to say one more thing before I finish," I said, and the room, still buzzing faintly from the investigator's exit, quieted again to listen. This company was founded by my great-grandfather, lost by my family through circumstances that were never fully their fault, and rebuilt, without any of you knowing it, by his great-granddaughter, using money given to her by a grandmother who believed in her when almost no one else did. I paused, my voice softening, the anger draining out of it and something closer to grief taking its place. I am not telling you this tonight to humiliate anyone in this room. I am telling you because every single person who works on that plant floor deserves to know that their jobs are secure, that the person who nearly cost them everything has been stopped, and that this company's next 75 years will be built on honesty, not on inflated invoices and quiet cruelty toward the people who are supposed to be family. I stepped back from the podium then, and Daniel Reyes returned to close the formal program, thanking the room for their patience through what he gently called an unusually eventful evening, and the ballroom slowly, unevenly began to move again, conversations rising in hushed, urgent clusters, employees turning to each other with wide eyes, a few of them, I noticed, turning toward my father's table not with sympathy, but with something closer to the same cold clarity Walt Higgins had shown me in that diner off Route 9. I walked back to my seat at the rear table, my legs steadier than I expected, and sat down, and did not look toward my family again for several long minutes, giving them, and myself, the space to absorb what had just happened before whatever came next. It was Sophie who reached me first, weaving through the tables in a plain blue dress, her eyes wide with an expression that held confusion and awe in equal measure. She stopped in front of my table, glancing back once toward her parents' empty section before looking at me directly. "You are Aunt Claire," she said, not quite a question, working it out in real time the way she worked out a difficult sketch, piece by piece. "You are the Claire from the library." I nodded, and something in my chest, held tight for months, finally loosened. "I did not know how to tell you," I said, without risking everything falling apart before it was ready. "I am sorry for that." Sophie did not look angry. She looked instead like someone finally understanding why a puzzle she had been quietly working on for years had never quite fit together until this exact moment. "Is the scholarship real?" she asked, and I told her it was more than real, that it was permanent and untouchable, and entirely hers regardless of anything else that happened to our family in the weeks ahead. She sat down across from me without being invited, the way only a 16-year-old fully trusting an adult for the first time in her life can sit down, and she said, quietly, "I always knew there was something different about the way you looked at my drawings, like you actually understood them." I told her that I did understand them, better than she knew, because I had once been a girl hiding sketchbooks from a family that called them a waste of time, and I had needed someone to believe in mine before I ever learned how to believe in it myself. My mother approached the table perhaps 20 minutes later, alone, her burgundy dress rumpled slightly at the waist, where she had clearly been gripping it in one fist, her makeup smudged faintly beneath both eyes. She stood at a careful distance, not sitting, as though she had not yet decided whether she had earned the right to sit across from me again. And for a long moment, she said nothing at all, simply looked at me the way you might look at a photograph you suddenly realize you have been misreading for years. "I do not understand," she finally said, her voice small in a way I had genuinely never heard from her before. "All this time, all these years, you built all this." I did not soften my voice for her, but I did not harden it either. I simply told her the truth, plainly, the way I had promised myself I would if this moment ever arrived. "I built all of this," I said, "starting with $40,000 your mother gave me the year you and Dad decided I was a failure worth writing off. I built it 3 states away from anyone who might have talked me out of it, because I understood, even then, that if I stayed close enough for this family to keep measuring me, I would never become anything you would consider worth the trouble." My mother flinched at that, and for a moment I saw something genuine move across her face, something that looked almost like the beginning of grief for a version of events she had never once questioned until tonight. "We thought," she started, and then stopped and tried again. "We thought we were being honest with you. We thought tough love was... We thought it was what you needed." I let a long silence sit between us before I answered, because I wanted her to feel the full weight of that silence the way I had felt the weight of every silence she had ever handed me across that same kitchen table. "You were not being honest with me," I finally said, quietly, without anger, only a tired, settled clarity. "You were being cruel, and you called it honesty because that made it easier for you to live with. I do not need you to apologize tonight, Mom. I do not think either of us is ready for that conversation yet. But I need you to understand that everything you believed about who I was wrong. And I need you to sit with that, the same way I had to sit with what you believed about me for 20 years. My mother's eyes filled, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she did not try to hide it, did not turn her face away, simply stood there and let me watch her cry, which felt, in its own strange way, like the very first honest thing that had passed between us in decades. My father never approached the table that night. I watched him, from a distance, sitting alone at the family table long after everyone else had scattered, his crystal plaque still resting untouched in front of him, his rented tuxedo jacket hanging slightly crooked on his shoulders, staring at nothing in particular. And I understood, watching him, that some collapses take longer to finish than others, and that his was only just beginning. Kim found me eventually, too, near the end of the evening, standing at the edge of my table with her arms wrapped around herself despite the ballroom's warmth, her champagne gown catching the light in a way that no longer looked like triumph. "You could have told me," she said, her voice tight, somewhere between accusation and genuine hurt. "You could have told me any of this. Instead, you let me marry him. You let me build a whole life around him while you just watched." I looked at my sister for a long moment, weighing how much of my old anger I wanted to spend on her tonight, and decided, finally, that she deserved at least a partial truth. "I did not know what Trevor was doing until 8 months ago, Kim," I said. "I did not build this company to spy on your marriage. I bought a company that happened to employ our parents because it happened to be the company our great-grandfather built and our family lost. What I found afterward was not something I went looking for. It was something I had to deal with once I found it, because it threatened people I still, despite everything, could not stop caring about." Kim's face crumpled slightly at that, and she opened her mouth to say something else, then closed it again, seemingly unable to decide which of the dozen emotions crossing her face deserved to be spoken first. "What happens to me now?" she finally asked, quietly, and I understood that underneath the question about her own future was a harder, more honest question about whether I intended to punish her the way our parents had once, casually and repeatedly, punished me. Nothing happens to you that you do not choose for yourself, I told her. You still have your position in marketing, assuming the board is satisfied you had no knowledge of what Trevor was doing, which the evidence so far suggests you did not. What happens to your marriage is between you and him. I am not interested in punishing you for choices you made without full information. I am interested, going forward, in whether you are willing to actually know me, instead of just knowing the story you were told about me. Kim did not have an answer for that yet, and I did not expect her to. Some things I had learned over 20 years of quiet distance cannot be resolved in a single ballroom conversation, no matter how dramatic the evening around it has been. She nodded, finally, something uncertain and unfinished in the gesture, and walked away toward wherever her mother had gone, leaving me alone at the table with Sophie, who had stayed through the entire exchange, watching her mother's retreating back with an expression I could not fully read. "Are you going to be okay?" Sophie asked me, and something about the simple, direct kindness of the question, coming from a 16-year-old who had every reason that night to be thinking only about her own upended world, nearly undid the composure I had spent an entire evening maintaining. I told her, honestly, that I did not know yet, that some nights take longer than a few hours to finish landing, but that for the first time in longer than she could probably understand, I felt like the ground under me was finally solid, built on something true instead of something I had to keep pretending. The days immediately following the gala moved with a strange, accelerated momentum, the kind that only comes after months of careful, quiet preparation finally releasing all at once. By Monday morning, the story had moved beyond Millhaven's local paper into regional business coverage. A mid-sized Ohio manufacturer's chief operating officer arrested on state fraud charges connected to shell vendor billing. Framed always with the same striking secondary detail that seemed to fascinate every reporter who touched the story: that the company's true owner had spent 5 years operating in complete secrecy as the estranged daughter of 2 of her own longtime employees. Trevor Hale was formally charged 11 days after the gala, the same span of time, I noted with a strange, cold satisfaction, that had once separated my father's toast from the reveal that undid it, charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement tied to the Meridian Freight Solutions scheme, facing, according to Renata Cole's assessment, a realistic likelihood of a plea agreement that would still carry significant prison time and a mandatory restitution order covering the full $1.8 million, plus civil damages from the separate action Ashcroft Capital had filed. His sister Renata Hale, the shell company's listed officer, faced parallel charges as a co-conspirator, and within a week, both had retained separate defense counsel, no longer speaking to each other, according to Walt Higgins, who heard everything eventually, the plant floor being what plant floors always are, a place where news travels faster than any press release ever could. Kim moved out of the house she and Trevor shared within the first 2 weeks, taking Sophie with her, into a small rented apartment on the quieter side of Millhaven, and filed for divorce shortly after, citing, in the plain language the filing required, irreconcilable differences that had, in truth, very little to do with irreconcilable differences, and everything to do with the particular horror of discovering your entire domestic life had been financed in part by stolen money and planned job losses your own father would have suffered under. I did not celebrate that collapse. I want to be honest about that too. Watching my sister's marriage end, even a marriage built on the foundation Trevor had built it on, brought me no satisfaction at all. Only a tired, familiar sadness that seemed to follow every part of this story, even its victories. The board of directors, in the weeks following Trevor's removal, unanimously approved a new operation structure under a promoted internal candidate, and, at Daniel Reyes's recommendation and with my full support, formally recognized Walt Higgins with a newly created role overseeing plant floor safety and worker relations, a position that came with a substantial raise and, more importantly to Walt, a direct line to executive leadership that no operations manager would be able to quietly override again. Walt called me the week the appointment was announced, his voice gruffer than usual, thick with something he did not quite name, and told me it was the first time in 38 years anyone at that company had actually asked him what he thought instead of simply telling him what to do. My father, in the weeks after the gala, did not immediately approach me, and I did not seek him out, and there was a strange, heavy silence between us that neither of us seemed ready to break. I learned, through Priya's routine reporting and through Daniel's occasional updates, that Richard Bennett had continued reporting to his shift as though nothing had changed. Quieter than usual, according to coworkers, the loud pride that had defined him for decades noticeably absent from his posture on the floor. Walt told me, in one of our calls, that my father had stopped making jokes at other people's expense entirely, that some of the younger workers had noticed and quietly speculated about what had happened to him, without any of them, apparently, connecting the shift to the ballroom scandal everyone in town had by then heard some version of. It was nearly a month after the gala when my father finally called me directly, using a number Daniel had reluctantly given him after Richard asked, repeatedly and with visible difficulty, whether there was any way to reach his daughter. I let the call go to voicemail the first time, needing space I had never once been permitted to take as a child, and listened to the message 3 times before I decided how to respond. His voice on that recording sounded smaller than I had ever heard it, stripped of the performance he had worn at every family gathering of my adult life. "Claire," the message began, and I noticed, distantly, that it was the first time in years he had used my actual name, instead of some version of my role in the family, the disappointment, the one who never learned. "I do not know what to say to you that would not sound cheap after everything. I have been sitting with what happened at that dinner for a month now, and I keep landing on the same thing. I built my whole idea of what a good father looked like around being loud and being proud in front of other people. And I never once asked myself whether the person I was proud of actually deserved it, or whether the person I was ashamed of actually deserved that either. I do not expect you to call me back. I would like you to, if you ever get to a place where you can. I am sorry, Claire. I do not think I have ever said those words to you before, and I do not think I said them in time. But I am saying them now." I called him back 4 days later, not because his apology had erased 2 decades of damage, but because I had decided, somewhere in the quiet aftermath of that ballroom, that I did not want to become a person defined by permanent, unmovable walls, the same way I had refused to become a person defined by unearned forgiveness. We spoke for nearly an hour, most of it uncomfortable, some of it genuinely raw, and I told him, plainly, that I was not ready to rebuild the kind of closeness Kim and my mother seemed to want. That trust was not a switch that flipped back on because a truth had finally been said out loud, but that I was willing, for the first time in my adult life, to leave a door open rather than seal it shut. He did not push for more than that. It was, I think, the first time he had ever respected a boundary I set without arguing me out of it. My mother took longer to find her way toward anything resembling real accountability, and in some ways her path there was harder to watch than my father's, because her cruelty had always worn softer clothing, dressed up as worry and concern rather than open contempt, which made it easier for her, for years, to avoid ever fully naming what she had done. It was Sophie, in the end, who forced the conversation forward, sitting her grandmother down one evening at Kim's small new apartment and asking her directly why she had spent Claire's entire childhood treating her like a problem instead of a person. My mother did not have a good answer, according to what Sophie told me later, only a long, uncomfortable silence, and eventually, tears that seemed less performed than any I had seen from her before. I visited my mother alone, 3 months after the gala, in the same kitchen where my father had once told me some people were simply not built for stability. She had aged, I noticed, in ways that had nothing to do with time passing, and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of finally being forced to look directly at something you spent decades looking away from. We sat across from each other for a long time before either of us spoke, and when she finally did, her voice held none of its old, brisk certainty. I used to tell myself we were protecting Kim by focusing on her, my mother said, staring down at her folded hands. And I used to tell myself we were protecting you, in a different way, by not letting you get too comfortable, too confident, because I was afraid, after everything with Peter, that you would fall apart again and we would not know how to fix it. I told myself that was love. I do not think it was love anymore, Claire. I think it was fear, and I think I let my fear decide who you were allowed to become. And I am so sorry that I only understand that now, after you had to build an entire empire just to prove to me that I was wrong. I did not fully forgive her that afternoon, and I told her as much, gently but honestly, because I had learned over the years that forgiveness offered too quickly is often just another way of protecting the person who caused the harm, rather than the person who survived it. But I told her I was willing to try building something new between us, slowly, on terms that were mine this time instead of hers. And she nodded, and for the first time in my adult life, she did not try to negotiate those terms down to something more comfortable for herself. Kim's path towards something honest with me took the longest of all, in part because her grief was the most complicated, tangled up as it was with the collapse of her marriage, the public humiliation of discovering her husband's crimes in front of the entire town, and the slower, harder recognition that some of her own comfort over the years had been built, unknowingly, on both Trevor's theft and on the family's decision to elevate her at my expense. It took nearly 6 months and several difficult conversations, some of them arguments, before Kim finally said the thing I had been waiting, without fully admitting it to myself, my entire life to hear from her. I used to think being the good daughter meant staying exactly where Mom and Dad wanted me, Kim told me, one evening at a small coffee shop in Millhaven, Sophie's college applications spread across the table between us, both of us there to help her with her essays. I never once thought about what it cost you to be the one who did not fit that shape. I think some part of me liked it, honestly, having someone else absorb the disappointment so I did not have to. That is an ugly thing to say out loud, but I do not think I can build anything real with you if I keep pretending I do not know it is true. I told her that admission mattered more to me than any apology she could have offered without it, because it was the first time anyone in my family had named the actual mechanism of what had happened to me, not simply the surface cruelty, but the quiet, structural comfort that cruelty had provided everyone else. We did not become close overnight after that conversation. Some wounds, I had come to understand over the course of that entire year, do not close on a schedule convenient for anyone involved. But we began, slowly, to build something that felt less like a performance of family and more like the beginning of an actual relationship. One built on honesty instead of hierarchy. Sophie, meanwhile, thrived in a way that felt to me like the truest justice the whole story ever produced. She was accepted the following spring into an architecture program at a well-regarded state university, her tuition and housing fully covered by the trust I had established before the gala, untouched by her parents' divorce, her father's criminal case, or any of the turmoil that had rippled through the rest of the family. She called me the night she got her acceptance letter, breathless with an excitement I recognized immediately, because it was the exact excitement I had once felt, alone in a Chicago studio apartment above a laundromat, watching a small investment finally begin to grow into something real. "I want to design something someday that actually gets built," Sophie told me on that call, and I could hear, underneath her excitement, the particular hunger of someone who had spent years being told her dreams were impractical fantasies, finally allowed to want something out loud without flinching. "I know," I told her. "I used to want exactly that too, before anyone ever told me it was impractical. Do not let anyone talk you out of it, Sophie. Not even people who love you, especially not them sometimes." Whitfield Industries, in the year following the gala, posted its strongest financial results in nearly a decade, not because of any dramatic new strategy, but simply because it stopped bleeding money through Trevor's shell vendors, stopped planning to gut its own workforce for a bonus, and started operating the way Daniel Reyes and Walt Higgins and Priya Nair had always known it could operate, honestly, efficiently, and with actual respect for the people who showed up to the plant floor every single morning. The relocation plan that would have eliminated 340 jobs was formally, permanently struck from every future board agenda, a decision I insisted on codifying in writing, not because I distrusted the current leadership, but because I understood, by then, exactly how quickly good decisions can be quietly reversed once the people who fought for them are no longer in the room. Walt Higgins, a year after his promotion, stood at a company town hall and told a room full of workers, without ever naming names beyond the ones already public knowledge, that the plant had survived something that could have ended it, because someone with real power had chosen, for once, to use that power in the direction of protection instead of profit. I was in that room, quietly, in the back, no longer disguised, no longer hiding behind a false name, simply present as the company's owner among people who had, slowly and gradually, over the course of a year, stopped treating my presence as a novelty and started treating it as simply, unremarkably, true. My father, roughly 14 months after that gala, retired from the plant floor after 33 years of service, and I attended his retirement dinner, a small, quiet gathering at a restaurant in Millhaven, rather than a grand ballroom. And when it came time for toasts, he did not speak first about achievement or discipline or showing up on time. He spoke instead, haltingly, about how proud he was of his daughter, Claire, for building something out of almost nothing, and for finding a way, despite everything he had done to make that harder, to become exactly the kind of person this whole town could be proud to call its own. It was not a perfect apology. It was not a complete repair of 20 years of damage, but it was honest, in a way his old toasts had never once managed to be. And I found, sitting there listening to him, that honest and imperfect was enough to build something new on, if both people were finally willing to try. I think often, even now, about that note in Nana Ellie's careful handwriting, tucked inside a folder of yellowed photographs in a storage unit nobody else in the family had bothered to claim. Some things are worth taking back. I understand now that she was never only talking about a furniture company in a small Ohio town, though she was certainly talking about that too. She was talking about a name, a legacy, a family's shattered pride. And though she likely never fully imagined the specific shape it would take, She was talking about a granddaughter's right to walk into a room full of people who had underestimated her, and finally, completely, take back exactly what had always belonged to her. Not a company alone, but the simple, undeniable truth of her own worth. I think, too, about the particular kind of quiet strength it takes to survive being called a failure by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, and to keep building anyway, in silence, for years, without any guarantee that the story would ever end the way mine ended, with a ballroom full of witnesses finally seeing you clearly. Not everyone gets that kind of reversal. I know that. Some people spend their whole lives quietly proving their worth to people who will never once look up long enough to notice. But I have come to believe, through everything that happened over those 11 days and everything that unfolded in the year that followed, that the proving itself matters, regardless of whether the audience ever arrives to witness it, because the version of yourself you build in that silence is the only version that ever truly belongs to you. If there is one thing I would want you to carry away from my story, it is this. The people who call you a failure are very often simply describing the limits of their own imagination, not the actual size of what you are capable of building. Silence is not the same thing as surrender. It can be a strategy, patient and deliberate, while you gather exactly what you need to finally be seen. And the family you build for yourself, out of loyal grandmothers and steady allies, and nieces who finally understand why you always looked at their drawings a little differently, can matter every bit as much, sometimes more, than the family you were born into and spent years trying, uselessly, to earn a place inside. Have you ever had someone in your own life decide who you were allowed to become, long before you ever got the chance to prove them wrong? I would love to hear your story in the comments below, whatever shape it took, however it ended. Because I think all of us are carrying some version of that 11-day wait, quietly, until the moment we finally get to walk into our own ballroom and set the record straight. If this story meant something to you tonight, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so we can keep telling these stories together. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I will see you in the next story.